Hi everyone, this is Grace, and today I'll be walking you through how I made this pumpkins set of 7 designs, so let's go. Now, if you've been following me a minute, you know I love shape series sets where I take one shape, a limited color palette, and just have fun. And this is kind of like my beginner entry version to a shape series set. I've done 7 designs here, all with a pumpkin. Now, I use this particular pumpkin from Ann Clark Cookie Cutters, but you can really use any pumpkin you have. And even if the pumpkin does not have 3 specific sections, you can just kind of make it work, you know? It's really great like that. This is a pretty big pumpkin, I will say. I think it's 4 inches, which is a bit on the bigger side and will make some of the wet on wet a little more challenging later on. But I think it's a great canvas, great simple canvas. So working with the limited color palette, we have orange, white, teal, and brown for the stems, of course. Although, stems don't have to be brown. You can make them different colors. I mean, my pumpkin is teal. Yeah, get creative. It's art, right? So the first thing I had to do though is to make a classic pumpkin. I find that sometimes when I do shape series sets, I kind of lose sight of the basic concepts for that shape. And there's no shame in those, first of all. And second of all, one of my goals is just to teach you all the basics and then all the extra fun, all the things you need to know. So this is my ode to the classic pumpkin so everyone can learn how to do it. It's orange, it's 3 sections, nothing fancy, just pure and simple. The 3 sections is flooding in sections, which means you alternate sections and you let those crust before moving on to the next one, so there's definition in between the sections, which is what I've done here. And I'm using my Thingamagenie by the Cookie Countess. That's this pink tool here. I have 3 different scribes always when I decorate, and this is one of the 3. So I did let the whole orange part crust before moving on to the stem. Don't really have to, since the stem mostly just touches the center section, but just in case, you went a little rogue with your size of your different sections, it's best, I think, to wait for the orange to crust over. And for this whole set, I'm using a thick flood. If you don't know what I'm talking about, go check out my video on consistencies. Yes, this is my own terminology, thick flood. I don't think anyone else calls it that, and that's fine. This is what I like to use when I'm doing a 1 consistency outline and flood, which is what I've done for this whole set. So this was made for a beginner pumpkins class. And whenever I do a class for beginners, I typically try to use just 1 consistency because I'm trying to simplify things as much as possible. It can make some things harder when you're using just 1 consistency, but it makes the prep so much easier. So this is one of those things that sometimes can be harder with 1 consistency if you didn't get the consistency just right. This is a large surface to cover. And not only are we covering this large surface, which when you're working with a large surface, by the time you get to the end of flooding it, it's had more time to potentially crust over. We are also doing wet on wet with this. And I don't know why I'm moving so slowly. Go faster, Grace. Speed is definitely the name of the game with wet on wet. It's a deceptively hard technique, I think. I mean, it's easy. The concept is easy, but sometimes the execution can be hard because you have to get your consistencies just right, and you got to move fast. So here I'm doing one of my little tricks, I think, yeah, with these 1 consistency sets. Sometimes I will have some of the colors bagged in smaller bags, and the reason for that is so that, or I do 2 bags to clarify. So I do a smaller bag and a bigger bag. The bigger bag is to flood, and then the smaller bag is to do any sort of details that I'm doing. because then I can cut the size of the tip of the bag smaller than a flood tip. And what's the and? I just lost my train of thought. And when there's less icing in the bag, it presents less pressure on the bag. So, you have more control over the icing when there's less icing in the bag. Although I'm looking at these and like, these are still kind of big bags of icing, so I'm not really sure what I was thinking, but here we are. And then I'm using my scribe to just kind of jiggle the surface of some of those last lines that might be kind of struggling to settle in by the time I get to the very end. And it is harder to pipe a line with flood consistency, just so we're clear. So that is harder because like the icing is coming out a lot faster, right? But I think it's all worth it just to make one consistency. So just doing the same thing with my stem here, rocking my thick flood. And in my instructions on this one, you know, with the stem, if you're concerned about the consistency, if it's too thick or too thin, I would err on the thicker side with the brown, just because, you know, you're working with a small area with that stem, and it'll help with any potential cratering that could happen. So something you could do with these 3-section ones is to actually use an edible marker to sketch out the sections if you need that extra guidance. I'm of the wing it approach, which is what I chose to do here, clearly. And you see me rocking another scribe here. Sometimes there's a rhyme or reason as to why I'm using a certain scribe, and sometimes it's just because it was the first one I could grab. I always have 3 on hand. I have that small metal one, I have the big pink one, and then I have a metal one that's kind of in between thickness. That's kind of like a standard size. So for the flooding in sections, you want to wait for that first section to dry. I want to say like at least 10 to 15 minutes. Just until it has enough crust so that when you pipe something next to it, when you flood next to it, it's not going to melt into each other. And then in terms of joining those sections, so you'll see here, first I do just an outline thickness of my icing. And then I squeeze real hard and I flood up next to the dried section. Some people will do like another outline next to the dried section, but I find it easiest to get a good seam when I flood next to it. I generally recommend making that seam in your first go when you flood it, instead of like not flooding next to it and then using a scribe to to join the seams. I just find that it can be a lot messier when you do it that way. Like I got a nice crisp seam this way, if any of this makes sense. Okay, the next part, do it on a paper towel and use a glove. That is just a toothbrush that has not been used for anything else. And I have pure brown gel food coloring that I dipped it in. And I'm just splattering here with my thumb. This is my favorite way to get a thin, fine splatter, but obviously it takes a bit more effort. If I'm going for more of a chunky, less consistent splatter, I will just use a paintbrush and tap a paintbrush. And that you don't need a glove with, which is nice. Definitely recommend a paper towel though, because that stuff can get everywhere. And that's just a simple splatter. So with this set, I wanted to give kind of all of the classic options for a pumpkin. So the first one we had just the classic 3 sections. The second one was a wet on wet plaid. Plaid's a pretty common pattern for kind of fall and Christmas, winter, holiday season. What was the third one? The third one was the splatter. We're on to number 4 now, I believe. So I also like to kind of have a good mix of 3 sections and then 1 full section like this. For everything, always recommend not flooding all the way to the edge, especially when you're a beginner. Sometimes, well, I think with this, what am I trying to say? It's better to give it a couple millimeters on the edge, to give it some space to kind of spread out. Otherwise, you're probably going to overflood unless you're some miracle flooder. This next pattern is a leopard print, which in the cookie world, y'all, we put leopard on everything. I have another pumpkin set from a couple years ago that has a leopard pumpkin, and I've gotten some nasty comments about my leopard pumpkin. I'm like, y'all, it's just whatever, it's a cookie. But anyway, I love leopard, especially for beginners, because I see this as the easier version of polka dots. I personally actually really struggle with polka dots because I struggle to get, especially with tipless bags, to get a really nice round polka dot and consistent size. I don't know. Polka dots are not my friend. So what's nice, because like with polka dots, generally you want them all to be exactly the same, right? But with leopard, you see what I'm doing here? Like all the white blobs, you want them to be different sizes, different shapes. The brown here, you're just rocking it, whatever. Like it looks good when it's messy, which I think is great, especially for beginners, or really anyone, but especially beginners. So I like to do techniques that, look great even when they're messy, especially when they're messy. And this is the kind of thing where you do not want to stab your cookie and shake it because you have a design in there. So that's why I did that kind of tapping option. Be careful though. And then I'm using my scribe to just kind of jiggle the surface of some of those last ones, just to help them settle. And then momentarily, I think, let's see. I'm going to let that crust, there we go, that crusted, and I'm going to add the stem. Easy peasy lemon squeezy. So leopard print is normally done with like 2 different shades of the same color in the print, in the white and the brown part, but I didn't have that in this set, and we are working with enabling constraints here, people. So I just rocked the white and the brown. I would generally say that usually the blob color is the lighter color, and then the outline color is darker, and just make sure that all contrasts nicely with whatever you flood it with, so that everything sticks out well. I guess that's if the kind of leopard you're going for. If you want a more gentle, less obvious leopard, then you don't need to make them contrast as much. Anyway, all right, we are rocking a teal pumpkin here. Teal pumpkin number 2. You will have noticed, maybe, that there are 7 pumpkins in this set. 3 are orange, 2 are teal, and 2 are white. And that was very intentional. I try to spread out the base colors as much as possible, and I figured if I'm doing 7, might as well make the 1 extra the classic orange. So, what can I talk about here? I don't mix any of my colors straight out of the bottle, to be totally honest. Yeah. I just don't. So the teal is a mix of blue and yellow with just a bit more blue. I know, not super helpful. There are plenty of colors though, especially with like a Maricolor that comes straight out of the bottle, and you could use those. Totally fine. I just personally like to tweak my colors. And speaking of tweaking colors, I mean, no matter what, even if I use something straight out of the bottle, which again, rarely ever do, but if I do, something I use to kind of harmonize my colors better is to, losing my train of thought, is to, before I'm ready to do the consistencies, I'll add a tiny bit of each color to each color, like a pea size. Usually, depends on how much icing you're working with, just to give them kind of the same, I don't know, undertone, something like that. It just harmonizes them so nicely. Okay, this we're doing here is the bear technique, and you want to make sure that that base layer is almost completely dried, if not completely dried. I think as an expert cookier, I play with fire sometimes and do not wait for it to dry completely, but I can't tell you how many cookies I've actually like poked a hole in the surface from my brush. But yeah, so let this dry. I'm using the flood consistency because that's all I have. If you use a thicker consistency, you'll just get more texture. You can see there, I just wiped off some excess icing because there is such a thing as too much icing with this. And I'm using a round brush that's relatively short, and that's what I would generally recommend for like maximum surface area. I can't imagine how long it would take if you used like a brush that has a narrow tip to it. I mean, not impossible, but just my thoughts. And this one here, you can see I did not wait for that top layer to dry, just rolled with it. I like the bear technique for two reasons. One, it gives some nice texture, and then two, when it dries, because it dries so quickly, it almost dries a lighter color. I think a lighter color than the normal flood. So if you're working with a limited color palette, it's a nice technique to kind of add some visual variety, even though it's the exact same color. Yeah, I swear it looks lighter. Maybe I'm imagining things, but I'm going to choose not to think that. All right, this next cookie, we are going to be covering this in sprinkles, in sanding sugar to be specific. So this is extra important not to flood all the way to the edge and like give it a solid even 1/4 of an inch, because the weight of those sprinkles is going to spread out that icing. And I think you're going to see even with this, because I'm using large sanding sugar, that it's really going to spread out. So let's see. With sanding sugar, no matter the color of my base, I always use white, just FYI. The color will come through. So I could have done this on teal or the orange. I really don't have any other sanding sugar colors. I was pausing because I think I technically do, but like I don't use them. I just think the white is chef's kiss. I mean, you could say you call it, I think it's called white, but like it's clear. So it's not, maybe that's what's confusing. It's not actually white. It is clear. I mean, I think all sugar is kind of clear. Anyway, okay. I digress. So at this stage, when it is freshly sugared, you can use your scribe or your hands to kind of mess with the shape a little bit, like push in some sections if they're starting to like fall over the edge, or like I was doing there, like there wasn't quite enough definition in those sections. But in order to do that, you have to make sure it's fully covered in sugar. Otherwise, you're going to be getting like wet icing on your scribe, which is not good. How gorgeous. There we go. Super simple, but I think super effective, and the icing doesn't dry quite as hard with when it's covered in sugar like that, which I really like personally to eat. Just a sidebar. I do find that those sprinkle covered cookies need a little bit more time to dry than the rest of the cookies. They still won't dry hard, but they do need a little bit more time before I bag them. So just keep that in mind. And here we are rocking the last one in the set. Oh yeah, that's what we're doing. I was like, I completely forgot. No, I did not. Okay, so we are going to flood this whole thing, give it a good jiggle, and then set a timer for 10, maybe 15 minutes. You can start with 10, but usually it takes at least 15 minutes. It's all going to depend on how thick your icing is and the environment you're working in, but usually like 10 to 15 minutes to start. And then you want to take something with like a rounded-ish end to it. Like this is a scribe from Amazon. Super cheap. I think I have icing on my hand. Okay, I'm distracted. All right, and now we are cracking the surface. I call this crackle or pokey poke. If you have icing come off on the end of your scribe as you're pulling up, you know you've gone too far because you're not actually puncturing the surface. You are, excuse, excuse me. You are cracking it. I just thought of the best metaphor, I think. It's kind of like creme brulee, like when you crack into the surface of creme brulee, except you're not digging out the inside. You're just making it look pretty and cracked. If your icing is not dried enough, it will look more like an indent than a crack, which is just a different look. What I like about the crack, as you can even see here, is that the light reflects on all of the different little indentations. And I don't know, it kind of looks like sprinkles, glitter, like, but without that extra stuff. So if you push too hard like I did there, you can just kind of encourage it back in with your scribe. And I didn't need this to dry anymore to do the stem. This was dry enough to do that stem next to it. And yeah, I think that's my other scribe. So I've used, or no, is this the Amazon one? This might be the Amazon one. Anywho, all right, that was the last one in the set. There we go. Super simple, like 7 different designs, but a lot of visual variety. Some great classics, great things to give as gifts, sell, what have you. As always, I enjoyed making this video. I enjoyed making these cookies. I hope you enjoyed listening to this video. You learned a thing or two, and you might even try these yourself. I really hope you do. That's all I got for today. Have a sweet one.